Today I'm going to tell you all about my So Simple shapes, and I'm going to show you how to make this easy applique flower block. So here on my design wall you can see that I've made 6 blocks so far. Each of these flower blocks finish at 18 inches square, and I've cut 2.5 inch strips and 2.5 inch squares for the sashings and cornerstones. Okay, so let's talk about my So Simple shapes. I'm using 2 different shapes for this block. One is from the Granny Chic. It's I-12 and it's the petal. And the other one is the circle from Vintage Housewife. It's J21. I also use my sew-in interfacing. For the circle, I cut my interfacing 3.5 inches square and also my fabrics. I go ahead and just trace right onto the interfacing around the template. For the flower petals, I cut both the interfacing and the fabric 3 inches by 8.5 inches. So once I've traced all of the shapes onto the interfacing, I go ahead and match them up with their fabric and take them over to the machine to sew them. And this is what they'll look like, these cute little appliques all ready to make the flower block. But before I sew, I do want to tell you that you need to cut your sashing strips 2.5 by 18.5 and 2.5 inch squares for the cornerstones. Okay, let's sew. So I place my interfacing on top of the square with my traced side up. That's my stitching line, and I want to be able to see it. I just continue sewing all the way around the circle on the line, and I do not backstitch when I stop and start because I don't want that to add bulk. But I do overstitch, meaning I will sew like about 1 inch over where I started. I just use a regular sewing stitch, just like when I'm piecing a quilt together. I like to clothesline sew these pieces as well. I just feed one end right after the other, and I don't cut my threads. Okay, I've done a few circles. Now let's sew a few petals. And I just sew them exactly the same way. I do like to use an open-toed foot when I'm sewing these because I like to see exactly where the needle goes onto my stitching line. Now typically when I'm sewing these together, I don't use a pin, but you could if you'd like. The only time I do pin is if it's a large circle or something like that I'm afraid is going to shift. Okay, so after sewing, I just go ahead and grab a pair of scissors and I'm just going to trim an approximate 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when I get to those points, I can trim a little bit closer to those points, but I just don't want to cut them off. Now we don't need to clip outer curves or anything like that because they will lie nice and flat. The only time we have to clip a seam allowance is if it's an inner curve, and there are no inner curves on these 2 pieces. Okay, so when my shapes are all trimmed, it's time to turn them right side out. I use a seam ripper or small scissors to make a little cut in the center of the interfacing only. I just need to make one long cut like this for the back of the petals. And then for the circles, I'll do an X. You just want to make sure that you're only cutting into the interfacing. I use this turning tool by Clover to help me shape my pieces after I turn them right side out. But first I just go ahead and do it with my fingers and shape it as best as I can. And then I'll take the tool and just kind of help with the edges, but I'm pushing very gently, and I'm only pushing on the fabric, not the interfacing. And I'm just kind of rolling it around until I feel it's pushed out enough. Then I go ahead and do the same thing with the petal. Now with the petal has some points, and so I just use the tip of that to gently go into those points and push that out a bit. I turn my tool sideways a little bit go to the other end, and then I can just go ahead and lay it on the table and shape the sides. Okay, those shapes look pretty good. So it's time for pressing. I like to use my roller, or I can use both by rolling it first and then just doing a quick press on the iron. Okay, now I'm going to show you how I lay it out into a block. First, I cut my background fabric 20 inches square because I want it a little bit larger to allow the edges for fraying when you're applique. Most of the time that happens, and then I'll just trim it down afterwards. I'm going to end up glue basting, but first I'm going to pin my shapes to the background with the design board behind it. And I use the guides on the background fabric that I have pressed in half and then diagonally. And that way I always have points that I can line up on all of those seams. First I do 4 petals, and then I do the diagonal petals last and just kind of slip them in just until they're touching. And I go ahead and just put 2 pins, and I'm going to do the center circle later. First I'm going to glue all of the petals down first. Now when I'm machine appliquing, I like to just glue all the petals and applique them first. Then I can hide my seams under there, and then I'll go ahead and just put the circle on and applique it last. This glue I'm using is by Sue Daly, and I really love it. It's water soluble, and I like that it can hold the applique pieces down, but I can remove them if I have to. I just gently pull an applique off, and I can reposition it if I need to. After I've put the glue on, I usually let it sit for about 15 minutes to let it dry before I can begin applique. Now I don't use a lot of the glue, I just put a few drops here and there to hold the shape down. After the glue is dried, then I can take my pins out. So this is how I would have my block all set up and ready for machine applique. I would save my circle till last. This one I've already machine appliqued, so I can go ahead and put the circle on. So I'll go ahead and show you how I do that with this block. I just want to make sure that I get my circle in the center, and so I'll use a ruler and just measure the petals in about 6.5 inches. And then I'll go ahead and pin it in place, and then I'll glue it. So when I machine applique, I use a tiny little zigzag stitch. So I'm going to take you into my kitchen where I have my Bernina set up. I have my stitch length set at about 1.5 and my stitch width set at 1.5, and my Bernina, of course, is set on the zigzag stitch. Now whether I'm machine appliquing or hand appliquing, I do use matching thread to match the applique shapes, not the background. I don't change the bobbin thread when I'm machine appliquing. I just leave it white or off-white because that doesn't show at the top. I really like to match my thread to my applique so that you can hardly see the stitch. And I don't even know if you can see the stitch on these petals that I have already machine appliqued. Now when I'm going around the circle, I do use an open-toed foot, and of course I use an open-toed foot on the petals as well. I just want to see exactly where my needle is going in, and I just go all the way around. I don't backstitch where I start, but I do backstitch when I stop. And then I just go ahead and trim my thread off when I'm finished. And machine applique is really fast, and you can have a beautiful finish, and no one can even tell if it's machine appliqued or not unless they look very closely. Okay, so that's what the back looks like with the white bobbin thread, and my machine applique block is completed. And now I'm going to show you how I hand applique for those of you who love to do handwork. So here I've got my matching thread that's the same that's in the machine. I'm going to go ahead and hand applique using the same print. And I cut my thread about 18 inches long. It's a single thread, and I knot the end. I start by coming through the applique on the back and coming out on the very edge. and then I just go straight back into the background exactly where I came out, and I just keep going back in. And I'm traveling across the back of the block, and I'll show you what the back looks like in a minute. I don't take real tiny stitches because I've used the interfacing and the pieces are already sewn, meaning there's no raw edges to turn under. I just go ahead and do the same applique stitch that you would to do traditional needle turn, and I just go all the way around. I love it because I don't need to use really tiny stitches, meaning not close together. So I just keep going around, and when I knot, I'll go ahead and go to the very back of the block, and I'll take a little bite behind that applique so that it doesn't show on the background, and I'll just do a couple of knots by going through the loop, and then I'll hide my tail end underneath the applique just like you do when you're hand quilting, and cut it off. And that's your applique. So now I'm going to take this block over and I'm going to show you how to press it and trim it up. So I press it from the back, and I usually press from the center out. You can use water, a little bit of starch if you'd like. I would not recommend using steam at all. You don't want to shrink up your pieces, but I can mist it with a little bit of water. And I just go ahead and press it out until it's nice and smooth, and then I let it cool. As soon as it cools down, I can go over to the cutting board and I'm going to show you how I trim it up. I use my trim it ruler that is size 18.5, and I center the appliques using the lines on the ruler, and I just trim one side at a time. And each time I'm trimming the sides, I go ahead and line up with the lines again. All of the lines on the rulers are the same as the lines were when you pressed the block before appliquing, in half and then on the diagonal. And that way you know you've got your block all centered. Now if you're making a quilt like I am, when you're sewing your blocks together, you just sew your sashing strips in between. Now besides a quilt, I wanted to show you that you can make a really cute pillow out of this flower block. This pillow is 24 inches square, and so you would just cut your background fabric larger to accommodate the pillow form. I hope you love my flower block using my Sew Simple shapes and my Vintage Happy 2 collection. Chat with you next time.